So today I want to make a prediction, a specific, concrete, falsifiable prediction about what the world looks like when this war is over. Not a vague statement about the global order changing, not a general observation about geopolitical trends, a specific claim about 5 specific countries that will not exist in their current form when this war ends. 5 nations whose borders, whose governments, whose internal political arrangements, whose fundamental character as states are going to be so profoundly altered by this war and its consequences that the countries that emerge from this period will be almost unrecognizable compared to the ones that entered it. And I want to be clear about what I mean by not existing in their current form. I am not talking about countries being erased from the map. I am not talking about formal dissolution or territorial partition in every case. I am talking about something more subtle and in some ways more significant. I am talking about states whose internal coherence, whose governmental legitimacy, whose economic foundation, whose social contract is going to be so fundamentally transformed by the pressures this war is creating that calling them the same country will be in any meaningful sense inaccurate. The name on the map will be the same. The reality will be entirely different. So let us go through them one by one, because each story is distinct. Each transformation is being driven by different forces. And each outcome, when you understand it clearly, tells you something essential about where the world is going. Before I go through each country, I want to give you one piece of historical context that frames everything I'm about to say, because state transformation of the kind I'm describing has happened before in this region. And the last time it happened, the consequences lasted a century. The year is 1916. The British and French empires, in the middle of the First World War, drew a line on a map of the Middle East in a secret agreement known as Sykes-Picot. That line divided the territory of the collapsing Ottoman Empire between British and French spheres of influence. It created borders that had nothing to do with the ethnic, religious, tribal, or economic realities of the people who lived there. It drew Iraq as a single country containing Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish populations that had never seen themselves as part of the same political community. It created Lebanon as a French mandate, artificially balancing Maronite, Christian, and Muslim populations. It drew Syria across tribal lines that still produce conflict today, 110 years. Later, we are still living with the consequences of those lines on that map. The borders created in 1916 are the borders that are now being challenged by the pressures of this war. And what replaces them will define the region for the next century. That is the scale of what we are talking about. That is the weight of these 5 stories. Country 1, Lebanon. Lebanon is not waiting for this war to transform it. Lebanon was already one of the most fragile states on earth before the first strike of Operation Epic Fury. A nation that has not had a functioning government in any real sense for years. A nation where the electricity grid works for perhaps 4 hours per day on average. A nation where the banking system collapsed in 2019 and depositors lost access to their savings, in many cases permanently. A nation where the currency lost 90% of its value in less than 3 years. A nation where Hezbollah, a non-state military actor, has more effective power than the national army. Lebanon was already a failed state in almost every meaningful measure before this war began. And this war is delivering the final blow. Hezbollah, Lebanon's most powerful political and military force, is deeply embedded in the conflict on the Iranian side. Its leadership has been significantly degraded. Its weapon stockpiles have been targeted. Its financial supply lines from Iran have been disrupted. And its political position within Lebanon, which was already complicated by the country's sectarian divisions and its economic catastrophe, is becoming more contested as ordinary Lebanese citizens ask the question that Hezbollah has always feared most. Was it worth it? Was Hezbollah's strategic alignment with Iran, the alignment that brought Israeli and American firepower to bear on Lebanese territory and infrastructure, worth the price that Lebanon is paying? That question, increasingly being asked openly, is the question that ends the political arrangement that has defined Lebanon for 3 decades. Hezbollah's dominance rests on its ability to deliver security and services to its constituency. A degraded, financially weakened, militarily diminished Hezbollah can do neither as effectively, and a Lebanese political system that has always been paralyzed by sectarian balance is not suddenly going to produce effective governance to fill the vacuum. What fills the vacuum in Lebanon when Hezbollah's power recedes is not a functioning liberal democracy. It is a different kind of disorder, a reconfiguration of the sectarian power balance, external powers competing for influence, and a humanitarian situation that goes from catastrophic to something beyond the vocabulary of normal crisis management. The Lebanon that emerges from this war will still be called Lebanon, but the Lebanese state as a coherent political entity, which was already barely surviving, will have been definitively ended. What replaces it will be something new, fragile, and almost certainly managed by external powers. France, Saudi Arabia, potentially Iran, in a reduced capacity, rather than by Lebanese institutions that have demonstrated no capacity to manage anything. Country 2, Yemen. Yemen is perhaps the clearest case of a country that has already ceased to exist in any meaningful sense and whose post-war configuration will simply make that reality official. The Yemeni civil war, which began in 2015, has already divided the country into at least 3 distinct zones of control. The Houthi north, allied with Iran, controlling Sana'a and the most populous parts of the country. The internationally recognized government south, nominally allied with Saudi Arabia, but itself fractured between multiple competing forces. And the areas controlled by the Southern Transitional Council, which wants independence for southern Yemen and has the backing of the UAE, 3 Yemens, effectively, each with its own governance, its own military forces, its own economic arrangements, its own external patrons. This war is making those divisions permanent. The Houthis have been deeply integrated into Iran's war strategy, launching drone and missile attacks on Gulf shipping, on Saudi Arabian infrastructure, on American naval assets in the Red Sea. They have been struck heavily in response. Their military capability has been degraded, but their political position in northern Yemen, their legitimacy as the defenders of Yemeni sovereignty against American and Saudi aggression, has been strengthened by exactly the same strikes that degraded their military capacity. You cannot bomb a movement into irrelevance in a country where that movement is genuinely seen by its constituency as the only force willing to stand and fight. And in the south, the anti-Houthi forces have used the distraction of the larger war to consolidate their control, to resist reunification pressures, to build the facts on the ground that make a unified Yemen increasingly implausible. The Yemen that emerges from this war will be 2 or 3 permanent entities, perhaps with different names, perhaps with formal international recognition of their separation, perhaps simply as frozen conflict zones that everyone pretends might someday reunify. But the fiction of a unified Yemeni state will have been abandoned. Not officially. Nothing in the Middle East ever ends officially, but functionally, irreversibly. Country 3, Iraq. Iraq is the country in this list whose transformation is most directly connected to the shifting balance of power between America and Iran. Because Iraq is the primary terrain on which American and Iranian influence have competed for 2 decades, and the outcome of this war is going to determine which of those 2 forces has a dominant say over what Iraq actually is. Currently, Iraq exists in a paradox that would be comic if it were not so consequential. Iraq is simultaneously an American ally hosting thousands of American troops and significant American military infrastructure, and an Iranian client state with an Iranian-aligned government, Iranian-backed militia forces that are more powerful than the national army, and an economy deeply integrated with Iran. This paradox has been managed barely through the convenient fiction that Iraq is a sovereign state making its own decisions. That fiction has served both America and Iran because it allowed them to maintain their competing presences without forcing a direct confrontation over who actually controls the country. This war is ending that fiction. The Iraqi government is under intense domestic pressure from its Iranian-aligned political base to demand American withdrawal. Every American strike on Iranian territory does more than degrade military capability. It reshapes political reality inside Iraq. Each strike becomes political ammunition for Iraqi factions that have, for years, demanded the removal of American forces. What was once a managed contradiction in Iraq simultaneously aligned with Washington and deeply influenced by Tehran is becoming increasingly unstable. The argument that American presence guarantees security is weakening, and as that argument weakens, the balance inside Iraq shifts. If the United States loses strategic leverage in the region as a result of this war, the Iraqi political system will not remain neutral. It will tilt. Pressure will mount within parliament, within militias, and within the broader political class to formalize what has long been informally true, that Iraq cannot indefinitely host 2 competing powers on its soil. The likely outcome is not chaos in the immediate sense, but clarity. An Iraq without American troops becomes an Iraq where Iranian influence operates without meaningful constraint. Militias aligned with Tehran face no counterweight. Economic integration deepens. Political alignment hardens. Iraq does not disappear from the map, but it becomes something fundamentally different. A state that exists in name as sovereign, but in practice as part of Iran's strategic depth. The 4th country is Pakistan, and its transformation carries stakes far beyond the region because Pakistan is a nuclear power. A nuclear state under severe internal stress is one of the most dangerous scenarios in global geopolitics, not because collapse is inevitable, but because instability introduces risks that cannot be easily contained. Even before this war, Pakistan was under immense strain. Its economy had already entered crisis, requiring intervention from the International Monetary Fund. Its currency had sharply depreciated. Its political system was locked in confrontation between a powerful military establishment and a civilian political movement centered around Imran Khan, whose imprisonment did not diminish his popular support. At the same time, Pakistan's security environment was deteriorating. with rising tensions along its border with Afghanistan and the persistent strategic rivalry with India. This war adds a new layer of pressure, energy, shock. Pakistan depends heavily on imported oil, much of it from the Gulf. As prices rise, the cost is not abstract. It directly consumes the country's already fragile foreign exchange reserves. Economic pressure feeds political instability. Political instability reshapes institutional balance. And in states under stress, populations often gravitate toward actors promising decisive, even radical solutions. The Pakistan that emerges from this period may retain its borders and its name, but its internal structure could shift dramatically. The balance between civilian authority, military control, Islamist political movements, and the command and control integrity of its nuclear arsenal may be altered in ways that redefine the nature of the state itself. There is an optimistic path, one in which the military stabilizes the system while maintaining strict nuclear security. And there are darker path scenarios that analysts rarely describe publicly, but quietly consider. Pakistan's future now lies somewhere within that range, and this war is accelerating the forces that will determine where it lands. For the fifth and final case, the transformation is not confined to a single country. It applies to a regional system, the Gulf Cooperation Council. For decades, the GCC has functioned as one of the most effective frameworks for regional coordination in the developing world. It brought together Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain into a structure that amplified their economic strength and provided a degree of collective security. But that structure rests on two pillars: internal strategic alignment and the external guarantee of American protection. This war is putting both under strain. Internally, the member states do not see the conflict the same way. Saudi Arabia faces direct threats to its energy infrastructure and feels pressure to respond forcefully. The UAE, whose prosperity depends on stability and global confidence, is far more cautious about escalation. Qatar maintains diplomatic channels with Iran and operates with a distinct strategic logic shaped by its natural gas dominance. Kuwait and Bahrain, smaller and more exposed, must calculate risk in entirely different terms. As these interests diverge, the illusion of unified strategy weakens. At the same time, the reliability of the American security umbrella, the very foundation that allowed these differences to coexist, is being tested. If the United States cannot fully secure critical routes like the Strait of Hormuz or prevent strikes on Gulf infrastructure, then each member state must begin recalculating its own survival strategy independently. The GCC will not formally dissolve. Its institutions will remain, but its essence will change. What was once a coordinated bloc becomes a looser framework, one in which each state increasingly pursues its own path. Saudi Arabia may seek its own accommodation with Iran. The UAE may deepen ties with global powers like China. Qatar may expand its diplomatic autonomy even further. The structure survives, but the cohesion that gave it real power begins to fade. What connects all five of these transformations is a deeper pattern, one that matters more than any single country. Each of these states was held together not purely by internal unity, but by external forces. Lebanon relied on a fragile sectarian balance reinforced by outside influence. Yemen was sustained in part by external funding and diplomatic recognition. Iraq depended on American presence to maintain equilibrium among competing factions. Pakistan relied on institutional discipline and external economic support to preserve stability. The GCC depended on American security guarantees to maintain collective alignment. When external pressure changes, the true structure of a state is revealed. And what is being revealed across these cases is not cohesive national unity, but underlying fragmentation, competing identities, competing interests, competing visions of power and governance. This war is not simply destroying military assets or redrawing lines on a map. It is exposing the foundations of a regional order that was always more fragile than it appeared. It is accelerating transformations that were already underway, pushing systems past their breaking points. The changes will not happen all at once. The Middle East does not transform in a single moment. It changes gradually until suddenly it does not. We are in the early phase now, where pressure accumulates and cracks begin to form. The decisive phase comes later, when those cracks become impossible to ignore. By that point, the countries we recognize today will still exist in name. Their flags will still fly. Their borders may still appear unchanged. But the reality behind those symbols will be fundamentally different. And that is the prediction. 5 states, unchanged on the map, but transformed beyond recognition in substance.